Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, in today's episode we're going to pay tribute to Christopher Tolkien, who sadly passed away on January 16th. Before I get to that, I wanted to mention that my friends at Online Great Books are just about to open up another enrollment period. If you've always wanted to read the great books but didn't get the chance to study them in college, or you don't have access to a discussion group near you, or you just find it a little intimidating to approach these great works of Western literature and philosophy and theology, I highly recommend Online Great Books. And the reason I say that is because the program is specifically designed to work for people who have day jobs and families and can't just spend time reading and discussing books all day. It proceeds at a very accessible pace. The program goes through almost the entire list of great books of the Western world made by Mortimer Adler. They send you each book as you reach it with your seminar group. Every month, you'll attend a seminar using video conferencing technology, and you'll discuss the great books: Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, with people from all walks of life, from artists to farmers to people with regular office jobs to prison guards, you name it. I found the discussion of the great books with people from such a variety of backgrounds to be very fruitful. And on a very basic level, just having those seminars every month and those reading goals, which are very accessible again, but it keeps you motivated to keep working at it. If you want to hear more details about the program, you can go back to episode 27 of the Catholic Culture Podcast, where I interviewed Online Great Books founder Scott Hambrick, or you can go to onlinegreatbooks.com. But the point is that they're about to begin a new enrollment period, February 14th to February 20th. And the folks over at OGB have kindly offered a special discount to Catholic Culture Podcast listeners. You can just go to onlinegreatbooks.com or use the referral link, the show notes page for today's episode, and use the discount code Catholic Culture, and you'll get 25% off the first 3 months of your Online Great Books subscription. Now, even if you don't feel it's the right time for you to enroll, but you'd like to consider doing so in the future, you can go to onlinegreatbooks.com and sign up for the VIP waiting list. Once you join that, you'll get one email each week for 8 weeks with a lot of useful information, such as how to approach the great books in the best way, how to become a better reader generally, with tips and tricks drawn from people like Mortimer Adler and his work, How to Read a Book, and a lot more. Again, I can recommend this program from personal experience. The time that I was signed up, those monthly seminars were kind of a highlight of my month, and I'm only sorry that I didn't have time to continue participating, but I definitely would recommend people consider it. And again, the discount code is Catholic Culture at onlinegreatbooks.com, or you can use the referral link at the show notes for today's episode. So now for the topic of today's episode, the passing of Christopher Tolkien at 95 years of age on January 16th. He was, of course, the son of the great Catholic author J.R.R. Tolkien. So first things first, if you're listening to this, I'd ask you to pause a moment and pray for the repose of Christopher's soul. And now that I think of it, for his father as well, so they may be reunited in heaven. But as to Christopher being the topic of today's episode, his work is of the utmost importance in understanding the legacy of this greatest of Catholic 20th century fiction authors, in my estimation. Actually, arguably, the author of the greatest work of fiction of the 20th century, in what many have recognized to be a unique collaboration between father and son. Christopher continued his father's decades of work building Middle-earth in combing through, editing, and publishing many of his father's incomplete texts, most notably the Silmarillion, without which we would be much disadvantaged in our knowledge of the true richness and depth and unique nature of Tolkien's artistic genius. But we also have Christopher to thank for a great deal more scholarly work on his father's writings, which we will discuss in this episode with my guest, John Garth. He is one of today's most acclaimed Tolkien scholars, most notably for having written Tolkien and the Great War, a groundbreaking biography focusing on Tolkien's early years up through his participation as a soldier in World War I. John, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good to be here.
I'd like to start with your own personal acquaintance with Christopher.
Christopher helped me, advised me, corrected me at a certain point when I was working on Tolkien and the Great War, and we occasionally corresponded thereafter, always because I had written to him with some query or request, and he was politely responding. So we had a mostly good relationship, always a polite relationship. And yes, it began with me approaching the end of Tolkien and the Great War, and it ended with Christopher's death. In fact, I had posted a letter to him on the eve of his death, which is a real shame that it never reached him. So to go back to Tolkien and the Great War, I worked on Tolkien and the Great War for several years, and Christopher Tolkien approved its publication in principle for the publisher HarperCollins in the UK. And at a late stage, I sent him an almost complete draft, with which it turned out he was not very happy. I'd been given the real privilege of working with Tolkien's papers, the letters between him and his closest friends during the First World War in particular, and also his collection of papers, military papers from that war. And Christopher felt that the book that I had written was too focused on pursuing an argument rather than telling a story. And that thereby I had in some way misused my privileged access to those papers. So this was a bit of a shock to me, frankly, and I had to think hard about how to respond. But it seemed to be at a very critical point. I wasn't really sure whether the book would ever appear, but I desperately wanted it to appear. And I didn't think it was a perfect book. So I was thinking about a way of addressing the problem with various edits and rewrites, sections of the book, to make it less focused on my argument that the First World War influenced Tolkien's writings, and more focused on simply telling the story of what happened and giving a broader commentary on the original development of his legendarium at that time. And while I was mulling this over, and communications seemed to be fraught because it was all going through the proper channels, through the publisher, through the Tolkien Estates lawyer, Christopher reached out to me and offered to discuss things with me directly, not face-to-face. In fact, we used a fax. And this was very generous of him, very sensitive. He need not have done it. I don't know why he did it, but he did. And essentially it meant that my book was saved. I made the changes that I've been mulling over. I think they improved the book, frankly, because now you can read it and you can go away and draw your own conclusions without me trying to proselytize too much. So that was the start of it. And his faxes to me were great. They were very helpful in spotting absurdities, of which there were a few, in spotting errors. He was very forthright in what he said to me. And honestly, I think that some people receiving that kind of thing might have quailed or been astonished or upset or defensive. But I, at that time, was working for the London Evening Standard, London's daily newspaper, which was a very high-energy place to work, where the people at the top had no qualms about being very, very rude to your face if you happen to make a mistake. So Christopher, he was so polite, and it was very easy for me to take it on the chin and deal with it. And it was just it was a joy to be in that position, working to get this book in its proper shape.
After you finished that book, did you have further contact with Christopher, or did he assist you in any other projects?
Well, he helped me with permissions for various things. So notably, a small book that I wrote as a kind of codicil to Tolkien and the Great War, which is called Tolkien at Exeter College. It's just a short account of his undergraduate days, and it's filling in a gap in Tolkien and the Great War, where, although I cover that period, by necessity, I have to say little about it because the focus is on Tolkien and his school friends, his friends from school before he was at university. So to have gone into his university career in depth would have been a large detour in a book that should not have been any longer than it is. So I saved all that and I went over it for Tolkien at Exeter College, and for that, I was allowed once again to go into the restricted family papers at the Bodleian Library in Oxford and look at a box of material that J.R.R. Tolkien had saved from his undergraduate days. So looking at things like photographs of himself with friends, his invitations to college concerts or literary societies he was involved in, and so forth. And then the final thing with which Christopher helped me is a project that I've been working on for a few years. I've looked very, very closely at trying to, I suppose, shed new light on a very important aspect of Christopher Tolkien's own focus on his father's work, which is the chronology of composition, the order in which things were written, and trying to establish, if possible, as closely as possible, exactly when things were written. So, in particular, I've been focusing on my favourite period, which is his earliest period, those war years when he was first inventing what became Middle-earth. And there was a big question in my mind about the date of a particular story, the story of the music of the Ainur, the creation myth at the start of the Silmarillion. And the question was, when did J.R.R. Tolkien first write that story? And I had a hunch backed up by various very complex evidence from published papers that J.R.R. Tolkien had misremembered when he wrote that tale. Christopher allowed me last year to go back to the Bodleian and look at the manuscripts for the Book of Lost Tales, the first version of the Silmarillion, to gather further evidence. And I've just actually last week completed a paper based on that research, which will hopefully appear in a volume being published by the Bodleian Library that was going to be a Festschrift for Christopher, a celebratory volume to be presented to him, but will now sadly have to be an in memoriam volume.
Actually, it might be worth asking because it sort of relates to some of the work that Christopher did. How would you explain to a layperson, what's the significance of that kind of chronology? Well, why does it matter what order something was composed in, for example?
The question of creativity in general is a fascinating one, a perennial topic of research. We all want to know, in principle, where the magic comes from when someone writes something or makes something or paints something or astonishing, right? That's why people read biographies of the Beatles or watch movies about Beethoven. And that's why a lot of us read The History of Middle-earth, which is the 12-volume series of books written and edited by Christopher Tolkien that trace the development of his father's legendarium from its beginnings all the way through to his death in 1973. It's a story that has to be told across 12 volumes because it's immensely complex. There are surprises as you go. There are reshapings. His father was not the most efficient of writers. You wouldn't really be able to write a guide for the aspiring writer based on the methods of J.R.R. Tolkien, because he would leave things unfinished, he would return to them, he would revise them over and over again. If you were lucky, he would finish them and publish them, but on the whole, the majority of what he wrote never saw the light of day in his lifetime. And the saddest aspect of that is that the Silmarillion, his life's work, or so he considered it, was left in disorder, unfinished on his death. And that problem was addressed by Christopher Tolkien in editing, quite astonishingly, that complex of chaotic papers for publication as a coherent book that was consistent with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, the previously published books, in 1977.
And when you say the Silmarillion was Tolkien's life's work, you're not exaggerating, because it goes back to World War I, essentially, in its earliest germ, and he's working on it up until his death at various times. He wanted to have it published alongside The Lord of the Rings, and in fact, it was almost a deal breaker with the publisher, to the point where when they said they didn't want to publish them both together, Tolkien went shopping around for another publisher, and it was only when that didn't work out that he went back to, I guess, Allen and Unwin.
That's right, yeah. So he flirted with Collins for a while, and then discovered that the Collins editor who'd been talking to him wasn't really that interested in the Silmarillion either. So he returned with great humility to George Allen and Unwin, who welcomed him back. Sadly, I think that furore, that problem with his ambition to have the Silmarillion published alongside The Lord of the Rings, took the wind out of J.R.R. Tolkien's sails, so that whereas he'd been immensely productive in between finishing The Lord of the Rings in 1948 and the failure of talks with Collins in the early 50s, he'd returned to his writings on the Silmarillion, and he'd rewritten huge amounts with great verve and beauty, applying everything that he'd learned from the huge lesson in craft that was the writing of The Lord of the Rings. And then, sadly, he never quite seemed to return to the issue with the same kind of energy after that. So what you have from that point onwards, from the end of the 50s, really, is a different J.R.R. Tolkien going back and looking at what he'd written earlier, and looking at it with quite critical eyes. And I think I think his self-criticism came from the sense that with The Lord of the Rings, he had written something of extraordinarily high standard, and he had some qualms about whether the Silmarillion could match it, for various good reasons. The one that always gets mentioned, I think Professor Tom Shippey has made a big point of this, and that's The Lord of the Rings benefits enormously from the sense of deep history behind it, the sense that the characters there can talk about and refer back to events in the distant past about which we know little. So there's a huge sense of three-dimensionality about it, and a sense of distant mysteries. The Silmarillion, because it begins with the creation of the world, can have no deeper history by definition. So that was one of the factors. I think another of the factors was just, I guess, the anxiety that you get as a writer when you realize you've got to please your readers. And I think that Tolkien had reached a point in his life where he'd lost some of his energies, some of his creative engine had switched off, and another engine had come into play as well, which was a desire to look at his own works from a philosophical point of view, to consider the philosophical underpinnings of the world he had created, and to write now with that mode. And all of this, of course, contributed massively to the problem that Christopher Tolkien had after his father's death. So not only were the papers in chaos, not only were sections of the Silmarillion existing in multiple versions and many of them unfinished in themselves, the whole thing unfinished as a whole, but also there was a difference in kind between things written before the Lord of the Rings and things written after it. The late material presented problems because it was straying into matters of philosophy. The marriage laws of the Eldar, of the elves, for example, was one of the things that preoccupied him. So if you have a married elven couple and one of them dies, can the other remarry? You can see the dilemma as a Catholic writer, because the elves don't truly die. Their souls, their spirits, continue to exist within the world. So yeah, that was the kind of thing. So Christopher had to make very tough executive decisions when editing the Silmarillion about what to include and what to exclude. And I think he quite rightly chose to edit a Silmarillion as his father might have envisaged it around the time of the completion of The Lord of the Rings, or a little later, but not too much later, before that turmoil of the late 50s to 1960s, when everything came under a rather destructive revision by Tolkien.
Yeah, that's interesting because, for example, that marriage issue just doesn't come up in the Silmarillion as we have it. In the published version, I'm sure some of it must be in the History of Middle-earth series, which I've only read a few volumes of, mainly the ones dealing with Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, but I mean, I've got to say, the material in itself is absolutely fascinating, and it is profound, and it's there in fact, in volume 10, Morgoth's Ring. For anyone who wants to dive straight in there are discussions about immortality and mortality, for example, which are just astonishingly thought-provoking and moving too, because he hadn't lost his ability to crystallize these thoughts within a narrative that had the power to uplift and to move.
Yeah, I can certainly believe that. And yet, if it's not of a piece with what had been written before, it's hard to form a coherent work with things with a very different focus and a very different tone. But we do still have some great metaphysical stuff in the Silmarillion, mainly the creation story. It's incredibly rich metaphysically, and I did a whole episode with Jonathan McIntosh, who wrote a book on Tolkien and Aquinas, where we just did a close reading of the first few pages of the Silmarillion from a metaphysical point of view.
Right, yeah. No, it's abundantly rich, and I keep finding new insights in there too. And I'm hoping that my attempt to establish a new date for its composition will help to shine new light on that creation story as well.
I'd like to jump back to Christopher's childhood, because he had a hand in the writing of his father's stories, or in the revisions process at the very least, from a very young age. And I think it's fascinating to learn about that, but it's also important in terms of sort of getting a sense of this as Christopher's sort of birthright, because certainly, especially early on with the publication of the Silmarillion, people would be questioning, Christopher's decisions in editing, which is fine, but I think it's worth getting a sense of how deeply he was involved as a young man.
Right. So he was one of 4 children, and he was the most of those 4, the most alive to his father's imagination, the most in tune with it. I say this with all due respect to the others, and especially Priscilla, who is still alive, the youngest child. Christopher seems to have just been on the same wavelength as his father from very early on, and he said some wonderful things that evoke this, and I hope you'll allow me to read a couple of things. So, well, first of all, he describes how in the evening he would come into my bedroom, and standing in front of the chimney, he would tell me formidable stories such as Beren and Luthien, for instance. Everything that seemed interesting to me came from his way of looking at things. And he also said, for me, the cities of the Silmarillion are more real than Babylon, which is an amazing way of looking at it. So in other words, his father's imagination had entered into him and opened out there and had helped build Christopher's mind from the very beginning. So that makes him, that put him in an absolutely unique position as a potential collaborator, which I think he was in certain ways, and as a literary executor and editor.
Even in his youngest childhood, Christopher did play a sort of a role as a proofreader in a sense, right?
Yeah, so they listened to The Hobbit when it was being written, and Christopher, and it was it was being read to the kids before the start of 1930. So Christopher was very young at that point. He was no older than 6, just turned 6 by this time, and he would pick up on points that his father had missed. The other day, you said that Bilbo's door was blue and now it's green, and his father would curse the boy, but be very grateful for these corrections and would make sure that he amended his story so that it was all consistent. And it's an interesting point. I think Tolkien Sr. was already pretty punctilious about these things. But in fact, if you look at his output, it's in the early 1930s that he starts to become very, very careful about pinning things down. So he starts producing annals, chronologies of events in Middle-earth in the early 1930s to make sure that everything is properly synchronized between these, complex, multi-threaded stories that he's writing. So you might wonder whether, in fact, that was a reflection of Christopher's passion for detail and consistency. But it's not just that; it's also just the sheer love of his father's imaginary world. So I don't think that someone with Christopher's sharp attention to detail and excellent memory would have had all the tools necessary for what he later did with his father's works. I think it took an absolute passion for the imaginative project to allow him to work like that. Because, the history of Middle-earth was 18 years of work, 18 years sitting, bashing away on his father's typewriter after his father's death. If he bothered to look at what little was said about these books as they were being published in the press, all he would have found would have been indifference and sometimes just downright scorn. And there's an awful lot of comments that have been made about scraping the bottom of the barrel or publishing J.R.R. Tolkien shopping lists, which is deeply unfair. What we have in the history of Middle-earth is, I think, a unique record of human creativity. There's nothing like the creative process that J.R.R. Tolkien engaged in, and there's nothing like what he produced, the books of Middle-earth, and there's nothing like the scholarly study of all of that which Christopher Tolkien has presented us with.
Now, Christopher, as he got older, continued to be involved with his father's writings and with his father's circle of literary friends, the Inklings. Would the Inklings have been after World War II?
Yeah, and I think, honestly, if we're going to talk about collaboration, we should go back to the very beginning of The Lord of the Rings, which was December 1937, because that Christmas holiday from school was the beginning of 3 years off school for Christopher. And you can imagine this was a crucial period when his father's beginning his real masterpiece, in fact. And there is his son there, the child who is most interested in these things. Christopher was his prime audience at that time, aside from C.S. Lewis. And it's clear from J.R.R. Tolkien's letters, having them as an audience had an impact on what he was writing. So, in terms of C.S. Lewis, I think that the story of the walk of the three hobbits across the Shire probably owed a little to a walk that Tolkien and Lewis and another of the Inklings had taken the previous year in Somerset. But it's no guess of mine, it's absolutely true, that Christopher Tolkien's taste for Hobbit talk encouraged his father to write an awful lot of Hobbit talk, to the point where he had to deliberately stop himself because C.S. Lewis said too much.
So when you say Hobbit talk, you mean like basically pointless but charming and humorous conversations between the hobbits?
Well, you put it very harshly. Ostensibly pointless, but there are many points being made in a circumspect way, yes. And then there's a later point in the Second World War where Christopher was in the Royal Air Force, and he was sent by the RAF to train as a Spitfire pilot in South Africa. And his father and him, they wrote to each other very regularly. And his father, during this period, wrote book 4 of The Lord of the Rings. So this astonishing section from where Frodo and Sam set out for Mordor on their own, meet Gollum, reach the Black Gate of Mordor, meet Faramir, encounter Shelob, and the quest appears to have reached its final disaster at the end of that book. He wrote that while his son was in South Africa. And he sent it chapter by chapter out to South Africa for Christopher to read. And Christopher said that he would come back from flying his plane and go off and read a chapter, right? And I understand that it wasn't a passive situation. You can get a sense of this reading between the lines in the published letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Christopher was sending his father not only encouragement, but also detailed critiques of what he'd written. And his father was responding to them. I mean, the known point on which he responded was not to change the name of Sam Gamgee, because Tolkien Sr. had decided that for philological reasons that Gamgee was not a good name for a hobbit, and he was going to rename him as Sam Goodchild. Christopher had deep affection for the surname Gamgee because it went back to stories that his father told long before Lord of the Rings was around. So it stuck. And then on a different level again, I think he influenced his father at that time in his writing, because his father was writing many letters of advice to him, basically saying, I hear you, I understand that what you're going through is unpleasant, onerous, disturbing, frightening, but I too went through this in my war, and I learned from it, and I survived, I came through, and you will too. I think it's clear that correspondence with Christopher took Tolkien Sr. back to re-inhabit his own memories of the First World War, and that these come out in Book 4 of Lord of the Rings. These come out most famously in the Dead Marshes, where Frodo and Sam and Gollum pass through among pools of water, where there are dead faces looking up out of the water. In the desolation before the Black Gate of Mordor, which is described like a blasted battlefield. And in many other ways through that book, which are less realist, less direct, less obvious. But, for example, in Faramir. So Tolkien at one point in his letters says that if anyone in my book is like me, it's Faramir, except I wasn't a good officer, right? So I think, talking to Christopher by letter helped to shape that book of the Lord of the Rings in particular, both through Christopher's criticisms of it, critiques of it, and because Christopher sent his father back to the First World War.
So after the war, Christopher comes back to England and gets involved in the Inklings, at least to the extent of coming to read his father's new chapters to the group because they preferred his reading voice to his father's.
Yes, his father had unclear delivery. It makes me think sometimes of his handwriting too. Sometimes his handwriting is beautiful and calligraphic, and you can hear him reading very well on the recorded bits and pieces from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit that were brought out on vinyl and shortly after his death, I think. But sometimes, if you see him being interviewed, it's almost impossible to understand, to figure out what on earth he's said at various points. And I imagine this was a problem when he was reading at length from The Lord of the Rings. So, yes, the Inklings very much welcomed young Christopher coming along and taking over readings. And I think his father appreciated it too, because it meant that he personally was not quite so much in the firing line, not having to perform while his work was dissected and disputed by the Inklings, who could be a very harsh audience.
Now, you already talked about some of the textual problems involved with all the different drafts of the Silmarillion or parts of it spanning decades with not only different story details, as you say, but with very different imaginative approaches. And I can't help but think that, part of the reason for getting more philosophical was the fact that Tolkien was now getting all these letters from people about the Lord of the Rings with questions about the philosophical and metaphysical implications of them, including challenges from Catholics. I remember a letter from a priest that he responded to in his collected letters, where he took some of these questions very seriously about the nature of orcs, about reincarnation. Christopher comes to a decision, as you said. He was decided to sort of pick the approach that Tolkien was taking around the time of the completion of the Lord of the Rings. The Silmarillion comes out. What's the response to that when it is finally published?
The reviews of the Silmarillion were a mixture of astonishment and bafflement, I think. So many recognized that it was an extraordinary achievement for one person to have created a mythology that had the air of being something that a whole people might have created. But at the same time, there were those who had no patience for reading it. There were those who missed the hobbits, especially. And I think that's a valid criticism of the Silmarillion, actually. I think that's why The Lord of the Rings is his real masterpiece. Not because of the hobbits in isolation, but precisely because of the hobbits in contradistinction to this more ancient, more grand, enchanted world. So each aspect is a foil for the other, and the hobbits are the people that we can put ourselves inside. We can see everything from their viewpoint. The Silmarillion does not have that, but it's not trying to. It's trying to be something else entirely. And I think over the years, it's been taken to heart by an enormous number of Tolkien fans. So there's an awful lot of Tolkien fans who think it's his best work, who say that parts of it are their absolute favourite parts of anything he wrote.
So my understanding is that some people were questioning, because of the lack of transparency at that time, so to speak, in Christopher's thought process in making the editorial decisions that he made. There was some question from people of, how much of this is J.R.R. Tolkien and how much of this is Christopher Tolkien.
Right, absolutely. And that was a very valid question to ask, even though I think Christopher, in his introductory comments, had tried to anticipate it and give assurances that it was virtually every word in it was his father's. If we're going to read something that says it's by one person, we don't want to suspect that it's really by someone else, right? And Christopher was acutely conscious of this. In fact, he apparently said that after it came out, he was so worried about what he'd done that he had nightmares. He told the French newspaper Le Monde, "I was in my father's office in Oxford. He entered and began to look for something with great anxiety. Then I realized with horror that it was the Silmarillion, and I was terrified by the idea that he might discover what I had done." What a terrible, terrible nightmare to have. So he set about then beginning to publish the history of Middle-earth, which showed it wasn't designed to show the process of editing the Silmarillion, but it does show the history of the Silmarillion and gives you an opportunity to read in essentially unedited form almost all the constituent materials and to understand where Christopher had to make his editorial decisions and understand why too.
He's already published Unfinished Tales at this point, correct?
Yeah, so Unfinished Tales is a kind of taster for the history of Middle-earth because, first of all, it has a rebarbative title, right? For anyone who's read the Silmarillion and already thought, well, oh dear, this is too much for me, they're not going to look at Unfinished Tales and think, that's the one for me. They're going to be put off by that. And I think that was deliberate on Christopher's part. He wanted to make sure that no one was going to be misled by this book. And it also introduces readers to the idea that his father's stories went through major processes of revision. So there's a chapter on the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, which discusses an awful lot of short texts in which J.R.R. Tolkien kept changing his mind about who Galadriel was, who Celeborn was, and their history together. So that was a taster for what was to come.
But it's much more readable than the History of Middle-earth series.
The thing with the History of Middle-earth, if you want to pick up sections of it and read it for pleasure, with most of the volumes, you can actually do that pretty well just by skipping Christopher's bits. I think you'd be missing a great deal if you did that, but it's not a bad way of setting out if you don't have that taste for scholarly commentary. If you don't feel the need to understand the creative process, if you don't feel the need to have, Christopher highlighting this is how a particular section differs from the published Silmarillion, you can go in and you can read a version of the Silmarillion from about 1930 from start to finish as an object of literature. Yes, it's more raw than the final thing, but it's there. What I love about the History of Middle-earth is that, among other things, virtually every volume has some nugget in there, some sort of unexpected jewel of a text that you'd never heard of before. So The Shaping of Middle-earth has this piece called Ambar Kanta, which is a description of the cosmology of Middle-earth, and it's just exquisite. I mean, it sets out by describing these vast walls of glass and steel that surround the globed Earth, and goes on from there. The next volume, The Lost Road, has an unfinished story about time travel through dream. And for people like me who are fascinated and in love with Tolkien's Elvish language inventions, there's a whole swathe of a mini dictionary of roots of Elvish words called the etymologies, which is just a joy to romp through.
I just started The Lost Road, and that's the one where C.S. Lewis and he decided that they'd both write some science fiction, and C.S. Lewis would write a space travel story and Tolkien would write a time travel story, and presumably we think the space travel story of Lewis has ended up being Out of the Silent Planet, where Tolkien didn't finish his story.
What they wanted to do essentially was to tap into this burgeoning new genre of science fiction in order to reach a popular audience. Because at that stage, this wasn't quite happening. It was a big breakthrough year for Tolkien because that was the year that The Hobbit was coming out, and I think he saw the opportunity to start presenting his legendarium not as a relatively indigestible collection of legends, but as something introduced through a science fiction adventure. And he only set it aside because he had to start Lord of the Rings. But I did want to come back to The Lost Road because it contains one of those points where I think people would miss out greatly if they skip Christopher's commentaries. So aside from the extraordinary skill with which he explicates, illuminates his father's writings and their development, a level of incredible detail because his father kept changing names of characters and what those characters did and how they related to other characters and how they fitted into the chronology. So everything was a moving target. And Christopher manages to pin all these butterflies down and present them to us. It's astonishing. But from time to time, among all this scholarship, you get a very beautiful passage. And there's a passage where Christopher is talking about the Lost Road and what happens there. And he says, so the Lost Road features the character Elendil, who in The Lord of the Rings is remembered as the founding father of the Kingdom of Gondor and the Kingdom of Arnor in the north, from which Aragorn and the Rangers eventually emerge. And in The Lost Road, Elendil is describing in one scene how the arrival of a sinister figure, Sauron, in Numenor, has turned everything bad. And Christopher writes, from Elendil's words, there emerges a sinister picture. The withdrawal of the besotted and aging king from the public view, the unexplained disappearance of people, unpopular with the government, informers, prisoners, torture, secrecy, fear of the night, propaganda in the form of the rewriting of history, the multiplication of weapons of war, the invention of ships of metal that traverse the seas without sail, missiles that pass with a noise like thunder to strike their targets many miles away. And then Christopher adds, when at this time my father reached back to the world of the first man to bear the name Elf Friend, because that's what Elendil means, he found there an image of what he most condemned and feared in his own. So Christopher, had the personal knowledge and insight to be able to write that with confidence. And a related point to this is that Christopher oversaw the writing of Humphrey Carpenter's authorized biography of his father. And I think that was probably another situation where he gave the benefit of his insight to help shape this book by a relatively young tyro biographer. Has aged quite well. It's certainly now very out of date because of everything that Christopher's published, but it's pretty good for when it was written.
You can see in the letters from J.R.R. to Christopher Tolkien during World War II, you can see a lot of discussion about modern war and the direction in which the world seemed to be going, the Western world at least, in those letters that are very, very much tie in with, the passage that you just quoted from Christopher.
Yeah, and also, though, in some of those same passages in his letters, J.R.R. Tolkien uses his own mythological inventions as analogies for what's going on. So he says to Christopher, when Christopher's out there training with the military, there you are, a hobbit among the Uruk-hai, a hobbit among orcs.
It's interesting to read the history of Middle-earth. So I've read the volumes dealing with Lord of the Rings in their entirety, and I'm now sort of getting started on some of the other stuff. But it's interesting because there's a lot of material that's great, and sometimes you think, I can understand why he didn't put that in there in the final draft, but it's still a fantastic idea or a great passage. And then there's other things, especially at the very beginnings of Lord of the Rings, when he didn't quite know what it was going to become yet, where you think, oh my gosh, I'm glad that got dropped. So, initially the story is about Bilbo's son, Bingo Baggins, and I just don't think Bingo Baggins was the right name for the protagonist of The Lord of the Rings. And then Strider is originally Trotter, who's a hobbit, who's so called because he wears wooden shoes, which make a trotting sound as he walks. What I believe the idea is that he had been a captive in Mordor at one point, and they had tortured his feet, rendering it necessary for him to wear wooden shoes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of. You could imagine an alternative history in which that book had been published, but I think it's a bit like if you're accustomed to listening to pop or rock albums that have been recorded in the studio, and then you get to hear things like the Beatles anthology, where the raw studio rehearsals are revealed. You can either enjoy that or not, or live albums, live performances. There are some people who just they want to hear it note perfect like it is on the album, right? And it's not like that. It's great. It's fascinating to just see the divergences. Even more fascinating when you see how they all knit together in a process of creativity. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite bits in that account of the writing of the Lord of the Rings is where the hobbits are hiking across the Shire and they hear a horse coming around the corner and they hide. And then this figure comes around the corner on the horseback and it's Gandalf. And immediately Tolkien turned back and rewrote it and made it into a sinister Black Rider. And that was, you can see, an unpremeditated epiphany, an unpremeditated moment of inspiration, which changed the course of that book.
So then it's a good jumping off point for what are some of the things, broadly speaking, about the unique creative process of Tolkien that we learn taking a big picture from the History of Middle-earth series? Because the details are not just for their own sake. They add up to a bigger picture of what kind of artist this man was.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, we learn the importance of invented languages in the course of his creation of Middle-earth. And we can see that in the History of Middle-earth because he keeps changing the names of the characters, and the names are formed from elvish elements, the names of the elves and the mortals in the Silmarillion and so on. We can see that a desire to be constantly creating would sometimes thwart the ability to complete things. So he would have a very energetic bursts. It's wrong to think that Tolkien, in C.S. Lewis's words, wrote like a coral insect, slowly and fastidiously. He didn't. He seems to have written in incredible bursts of almost Dickensian energy. And then, if he completed his work, he could go back and revise it with that fastidious care, which he also had. But sometimes he wouldn't quite finish something. So he did not finish the first version of the Silmarillion, the version he started in the First World War, the Book of Lost Tales. And when he returned to writing on his Legendarium in the 1920s, he had a new urge, and that urge was to tell some of those stories in narrative verse. So first of all, he wanted to explore the form of narrative verse that he most loved, the form of verse that he most loved, the alliterative meter that was used by the Anglo-Saxons and in areas of Britain in the Middle Ages. So a great poem that Tolkien translated, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is one example, and the Old English Beowulf is another example of alliterative meter. And Tolkien rewrote the story of Turin Turambar, the Lay of the Children of Húrin, in that meter. And he rewrote the love story of Beren and Luthien, and rhyming couplets. And then later he revisited it all again, and he began a new version of the whole Silmarillion and kept revising that. From that spring ancillary works like chronologies to keep everything synchronized, which then become increasingly works of art in their own right. So they started out simply as notes to himself about what happened when, and then they become pseudo-documents. They become works of historical writing by elves within Middle-earth.
There is a certain economy with which Tolkien uses his ideas. I mean, despite all of the unfinished drafts lying around, in the way in which he manages to incorporate, rather than simply dropping things if they're not quite right, he manages to incorporate them into a very different context or in a different form than they were originally conceived, whether it's a character or an event or something like that. It's interesting to see the way things get transformed, like Treebeard, for instance.
Yeah, so Treebeard began as a malevolent giant. There are notes to that effect that he's going to capture Frodo. He's going to be a real giant, massively taller than the character in the final Lord of the Rings. In the event, and apparently this was also unpremeditated, Treebeard, of course, turns into something entirely different and far from malevolent to the hobbits. Another example, which Christopher traces with great care, is the business of why Gandalf wasn't there when the hobbits set out in The Lord of the Rings. So in the published work, he's captive. He's been taken prisoner by the wizard Saruman, and he's on the pinnacle of the Tower of Orthanc. And this was not, by any means, Tolkien's first idea. Earlier on, he had been besieged by Black Riders in one of the elf towers that stand to the west of the Shire. And at another point, he's taking another of the hobbits who ends up as Fredegar, Fatty Bolger, in the published Lord of the Rings, as a kind of decoy to keep the chase away from Frodo and company. Or Bingo and company, as we should say, I think, at that stage.
After the History of Lord of the Rings series over the next decades, Christopher publishes a number of other things by his father, both directly related to Middle-earth and not. So at a certain point, this is it's also worth mentioning that Christopher had his own career as an academic for a time.
So Anglo-Saxon, Old English, Old Norse, and Middle English.
Close to what his father had studied as an academic.
Very, very close. And this is another reason why he was such an excellently equipped for his job of editing his father's writings, because that stuff flows through Middle-earth. It's like a kind of lifeblood, even if you don't recognize it's there. So he edited his father's poems based on an old Icelandic meter, and based on the saga of the Volsungs, the story that also inspired Wagner, famously, of Siegfried or Sigurd. The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun is the book that, as Christopher edited it. He edited his father's unfinished poem, The Fall of Arthur. So his father's attempt to enter into that tradition of Arthurian literature, which is powerful, a piece of writing. Very, very sad that it wasn't finished. He provided another full and coherent book for everyone to enjoy, The Children of Húrin, which can be read alongside the Silmarillion, or after it, or before it. So he edited Beowulf, a translation and commentary, which is his father's fairly early translation of Beowulf. Far more interesting, actually. A great deal of material from his father's lectures on Beowulf, which are fascinating and illuminating, both for Beowulf and for his father's thinking on all kinds of matters to do with literature and monsters and myth.
The events in The Lord of the Rings do correspond to a more big picture version of those events that's given towards the end of the Silmarillion. In the Silmarillion, although certain parts are given in more detail than others, Tolkien still wanted to expand certain episodes that he viewed as very important into more of a sort of full book-length treatment of their own. And namely, those would be the Fall of Gondolin, the Tale of Turin, or the Children of Húrin as it was published by Christopher Tolkien, and the Tale of Beren and Luthien. And these are all some of the more recent publications that Christopher edited. And these are, I've only read The Children of Húrin, and in fact, it's probably my favorite work by Tolkien other than Lord of the Rings.
No, The Children of Húrin is quite different from both Beren and Luthien and The Fall of Gondolin, the Christopher's final two books. In those final two books, Christopher essentially revisits material published in the History of Middle-earth, selects from it, selectively, how better to put it. In each one, he takes a single thread and shows us how that thread ran through the whole wider legendarium through the decades of work his father put into it. So The Fall of Gondolin was virtually the first story of Middle-earth ever written, 1917. He retold it in various forms. In the book, The Fall of Gondolin, Christopher presents the earliest version and later versions too. And he does a similar thing with Beren and Luthien. And it's quite a good introduction, in fact, to the history of Middle-earth. It's very accessible. The commentaries are not over complex. It's beautifully illustrated by Alan Lee, both of these books. And the introductory material by Christopher is really very moving, because he knew at this stage that he was approaching the end of his great project of editing his father's works, and he's reflecting on that.
So if you were to read The Children of Húrin and expect the same sort of thing in The Fall of Gondolin, for example, you'd be disappointed, but the Fall of Gondolin is nevertheless sort of somewhere in between the Children of Húrin and the History of Middle-earth series.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, in fact, what The Fall of Gondolin does include is the full 1917 tale, which is a tremendous piece of writing. As long as you can accustom yourself to a more archaic style of English, and to the fact that there are clear contradictions of detail, and the character of the world is somewhat different from from how it is in the Silmarillion. As long as you're prepared to accept that, you've got a superb piece of writing. I mean, an astonishing tour de force for someone who's just come out of the Battle of the Somme.
It's very interesting how we get these different versions of the Children of Húrin, and they're all, I think, worth reading in their own right. I think there's a version in the Unfinished Tales, if I remember correctly. I think that was the first one that I read. And then there's the version in the Silmarillion. And they're both fairly detailed, but the version published by Christopher Tolkien more recently, The Children of Húrin, really does function as kind of a novel in its own right, which I guess perhaps you can't say about any of the other things that Christopher edited besides the Silmarillion.
That's right. It stands with the Silmarillion. It's the same kind of editorial piecing together of a mass of disordered writings to produce something that is coherent and powerful and beautiful.
Do you have a favorite of these posthumous publications, sort of from if you were just to read it as a work of fiction standpoint?
I would probably agree with you. I'd probably say The Children of Húrin. But I've got so much pleasure from reading the history of Middle-earth over the years, and that is where my work is, and I do that work because I love it.
The Children of Húrin, I will warn people, it is certainly I would think, the darkest thing that Tolkien wrote. It's one tale within the whole of, people talk about Tolkien having the sense of tragedy, but this in particular is one piece of the whole Silmarillion, and it's one of the darkest parts, sort of removed from its overall context in the Silmarillion in particular. It is quite devastating.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the whole of the Silmarillion is about the creation and unfolding of a fundamentally flawed world, and why that allows for ultimate redemption, or at least it hints at that development. The Children of Húrin, it's a story of heroism against immense odds, both external and internal, because the hero is about as flawed as a hero could be. And it's, if you recognize, as Tolkien admitted, that it combines elements from the Finnish story of Kullervo, the Finnish Kalevala, the national epic of Finland, and the story of Sigurd, the Volsung from Icelandic saga, and Oedipus. So it's an amazing synthesis of influences injected with an astonishing life of its own, and it's deeply powerful.
He has a way with writing characters, especially in the Silmarillion, who are very proud, and it sort of comes to bite them, and yet you can't help but be deeply impressed with them. Fëanor and Turin being two great examples of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't speculate on Turin and Tolkien, but Fëanor is someone that Tolkien compared his own creativity to Fëanor's. Fëanor creates the jewels, the Silmarils, around which the whole epic unfolds. And he loves them with an inordinate love that leads him into deep folly. And I think that Tolkien explored temptations and flaws to which he felt that he might be prone, like a lot of great writers do. Like, I think I mentioned Dickens before, by creating characters who follow the logic of the flaw to the bitter end, or people who somehow come through are redeemed by things such as good fellowship, which we see more in Lord of the Rings.
Well, Galadriel is a character, I think there was something of that with her, not so much with her creations perhaps, but that she was one of the elves who left the Blessed Realm, the realm of the gods, essentially, because she wanted to have a domain of her own in Middle-earth. And when you know that, it gives a greater significance to her choices in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes, so this is the other point about the Silmarillion, and this is really key, I suppose, and the reason why most people have been impacted by what Christopher has done. He has presented us with a whole complex of story in the Silmarillion, myth, legend, and history, which massively enriches the way we can enjoy the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. You read those books before you read the Silmarillion, as I did, and it's wonderful to have that sense of misty distances. You read them after having read the Silmarillion, and the sense of richness is just increased tenfold.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great reading order is, The Hobbit, and then the Lord of the Rings, and then the Silmarillion, and then the Lord of the Rings again.
Yeah.
And then after you've done that, anything else you care to read. But I think that's a great way to get the effect, because you don't necessarily want to read the Silmarillion before reading the Lord of the Rings.
I have taught a course where I required the students to do that, but it was kind of a cruel experiment.
So if you had to recommend, let's say somebody's read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, let's say they've read the biography and they've read the letters. I would put them at informed Tolkien fan who hasn't yet fully gone down the rabbit hole. What other book edited by Christopher Tolkien would you recommend that they go to first?
I would be torn, I think, between one I haven't mentioned, which is The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays, because that's immensely illuminating in that you get inside Tolkien's head as a scholar, but also you start to understand what makes him tick as a writer. He's writing about the poem Beowulf with immense insight. This was a landmark lecture that he gave in 1936, which really has changed the course of Beowulf scholarship ever since. But also, if you recognize that what a source of inspiration for Tolkien was creatively, how Beowulf was that for him, you can learn an awful lot by reading that. And the other one, I think I would plump for The Fall of Gondolin, because that first story is so astonishing, and because it was virtually the first. And it gives you an introduction to the idea of the history of Middle-earth.
John Garth, thank you so much for coming on the show to pay tribute to Christopher Tolkien, and I hope we've done him some degree of justice in terms of his contribution to our understanding of one of the most significant figures in modern literature.
I hope so too, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.